Hi, everyone. You are listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, forthosewelostpodcast.com, and click on the contact button and reach me that way as well. This show won't ever have a members area or episodes that you have to pay to listen to, but there are expenses to hosting a podcast. And if you'd like to help, you can support this show at buymeacoffee.com/forthosewelost. In this show, people share their stories of losing a loved one to COVID. As the pandemic continues, many of us feel the weight of the world wanting to move on and the pain of our loss that holds us tight. For us, there is no avoiding the ever-present reminder that we lost a loved one to COVID. It is with us every day, everywhere. What you hear in each story is grief, sadness, and love. We will more than likely talk about the vaccine and maybe a little bit about politics, and you may not agree. But I hope you'll keep listening. I hope you'll stay to the end of each episode and realize that each person who openly shares here has experienced deep grief over the loss of a loved one. And that's something we will all experience. We all love someone, we will all lose someone we love, and we will all grieve. These are the stories of those we lost to COVID. Thanks for being here with me. I've got a great show coming up for you. Today, I'll be talking to Amberly in Missouri. She lost her grandfather Raymond to COVID on December 28th, 2020. This is Amberly's first time talking about her grandfather and his death and how it changed her life in so many ways. I also love that her grandfather's favorite song, one that Amberly doesn't particularly like very much, keeps playing in her car. Her bond with him and the special place he has in her life shines through in this episode. I also love hearing her talk about her relationship with her grandma and how they are coping. For context, we recorded this episode on April 29th, 2022. The song that plays in Amberly's car when she first starts it up and connects her phone is called White Sport Coat and a Pink Carnation by Marty Robbins. Amberly doesn't have that song on her phone, but it plays anyway. I've included a link to the song in the notes below. And with that, I'd like to welcome Amberly to the show. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about my experience with my grandpa.
Yeah, so we are talking about your grandpa today.
Yeah.
Oh, you live in Missouri.
I do, yes.
And where I usually start is March of 2020. And I think your grandfather passed away in December.
He did, yes.
And I'd like to start in March and just have you walk us through how you first heard about COVID and how it changed your routine and your routine with your grandparents and what happened.
So, my grandfather, he and the rest of my family, we didn't actually take COVID very seriously. It was something that it hadn't happened to us, and I think that's where everybody's perspectives kind of have started as it didn't start with us, or it didn't happen to us, so we didn't experience it. And then my grandmother actually got it first, and that's how we heard about it. The thing is, though, when she got it, she didn't have any symptoms at all, and she was one of the people who would have been chronic with it. And so we still didn't really think that much about it. And that's kind of where it got started, is it just started following us. We found out how contagious it really was, because it went from my grandmother to me to my mom, and we all had different symptoms. I think that's the crazy part about it.
Hmm. When did your grandma get COVID?
She got COVID really, really early in March. She
Wow.
got it, and it went right down the line. And I think that's the crazy thing, is she got hers in March, and she actually didn't. She didn't have any symptoms when she was in quarantine for the first 3 or 4 weeks. But around the time I had eventually got COVID, which was probably towards the end of March, starting in April, she was actually having a hard time breathing. Meanwhile, I was very, very symptomatic. I had high fevers, and I had completely different symptoms than her, because she didn't really have any until a month later. And then, I mean, the same exact timeline, once I had gotten over COVID, which took a, about maybe a little under a month, my mom got it. And my mom completely, hers was more, it wasn't respiratory like mine was. Hers was more stomach engaged. And then my brother got it, and he didn't have any symptoms either. So, I mean, it's so different, so wide range, and that was scary for us. And then by the time we had all had it, my grandfather didn't even get it from us. He went that whole time being around us, and he didn't get it from us. He actually got it from a funeral, from someone who had already passed of COVID. So it became very, very real to us. I mean, in a slow span leading up to his death, because we all, I mean, we're experiencing something so different.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that weird? I've heard that too from a lot of different people. There's people that you think they're going to get it and get so sick and nothing happens. And then other people who you think wouldn't have much of a response to it just get so sick. And even with long haul, so many people get long haul and it's just so varied. The symptoms are so varied.
It is. And so the funny thing is, my grandfather got tested 4 times before he actually tested positive for COVID. So, I mean, the first 4 times that he got tested, completely from completely different doctors, they were negative. But the last one he went to, they told him he was positive, and it was probably very serious, and that's where it started.
Hmm. Hmm. And so tell me a little bit about your grandparents and how important they are to you.
So my mother was, when I was born, she was pretty much a single mom. She dealt with a lot of abuse with my biological father, and she did everything alone. So my grandparents, they spent 4 or 5 days watching me in and out, in and out. And my grandfather was actually the first person to hold me when I was a baby, and he held a really, really strong father figure to me, almost. Um, and I mean, he taught me who I wanted to be as a person. He was probably my favorite person on this planet, and the way he had to leave Earth was so unfair. And so, I mean, with that, it made such an impact because of how important he was to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And why don't you go into the story of your grandpa and him getting COVID and what happened?
So, like I said, he tested 4 times, and they all came back negative. The last one was actually endish of November, around November 28th, and he was positive. And they told him that to go home and try to wait it out. And they gave him a very high dosage antibiotic and a Z pack, and that was really it. I mean, we figured he was going to have mild symptoms because we all had different symptoms, and he had proven to be healthy so far at 70 years old because he only took like 70 milligram of blood pressure medication. He was a pretty healthy man. And about maybe a week later, it was December 1st, he was admitted into the hospital. And I'd say out of all the things that stuck with me the most was when I had just gotten off work, and my mom called me and she said, "You need to pick up your grandma." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And she says, "You have to pick her up because grandpa's really sick and I have to take him to the hospital." And so I said, "Okay." And we had met somewhere, and our cars were really close as we were driving off. And I'll never forget, my grandparents were so closely bonded. They were married for almost 60 years, and in all 60 years, they never left each other's side. They'd spent, every waking moment together, and they were being separated for pretty much the last time consciously. And I just remember my grandfather, the first time I'd ever really seen him cry ever, his hand was out the window reaching for my grandmother.
Oh,
My grandmother, she kept yelling at me. She's like, "You need to go, you need to go." She was just upset. And I had never seen anything like it, and it tore me apart. I almost couldn't drive away because I had never seen that out of him. My grandmother was different, but for him to, it was almost like he knew that it was going to be his last time. And I know that kind of sounds silly in a way because I don't know that he could have possibly knew, but that's just, I'll never forget the way that looked, the way that felt. That was one of the hardest parts about him passing away. Um, but when he got to the hospital, they treated him for 3 days with antibiotics, steroids, and then they consistently kept checking his O2 meter. And my grandfather, because he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was exposed to a lot of chemicals and just a lot of viruses, he had a naturally pretty low O2 meter reading. And so it wasn't abnormal for him to read like 89, 88. But at the time, no, regardless of if it was COVID symptoms, regardless if it was, just allergies or something completely unrelated, no one was allowed in the hospital rooms at all. And my grandfather he wasn't feeling great, so he didn't know how to verbally express, "Hey, my O2 meter is kind of low already." So they immediately jumped to putting him on a ventilator. They asked little to no questions. I don't even know if they looked at his chart because they mistaked his chart and completely started him a new one compared to him already being a patient and adding on to that one.
oh,
And so they told him the best way for him to get through it was to be put on a ventilator. And that's according to the nurses because we really don't know because we weren't there. And I think one of the weirdest things about the experience altogether is my grandpa had a phone. He wasn't very tech savvy, but he could figure it out if he really wanted to. But the phone, when we had contact with him, was always through the nurse. The phone was always in the nurse's hand. The nurse was always in control of it. And I remember one night when they were trying to decide if he should be put on a ventilator or not, his phone, his personal phone, was in the nurse's hand. And my grandmother was talking to him. And finally he says, "I want to live." And that's it. Like, the phone just stopped. And then the next day we found out that he was put on a ventilator. And so I guess that's a personal decision he made. And he, on the ventilator, they sedated him and very heavily. And then we found out after the ventilator. So we're about a week into the hospital at that point. The hospital visit, and he died on December 28th. In that week, we noticed on his chart that he had very low numbers for his kidneys. The normal is like 60. His were at 27. So we called and asked about it because it wasn't normal. He had never had kidney issues before. And they told us the nurse didn't give him fluids. The nurse was a new nurse. They didn't give him fluids. They were really stressed, understaffed. And so my mom, she was so upset because, I mean, he was at the point where he needed dialysis. They started him on a dialysis treatment, and as soon as they started the dialysis treatment, he actually his kidneys started refunctioning again. They started slowly going up, and then he after his kidneys started functioning, they noticed that his oxygen levels were getting low again, um, and they should probably start rotating him to open his lungways because the position he was in wasn't working for him. So they started rotating him. Um, well, they had left him on his stomach so long because they wanted to rotate him, but they weren't rotating him regularly. They had set him on his stomach so long he started getting bed sores. Um, and they weren't taken care of. The one on his face actually got infected, and when we got to he had an open casket visitation. You could see the scar there that was like covered up by the mortician from the bed sore, and so that was just something else that added up that didn't make sense. And then the other thing that really confused me is we kept getting logged out of the charts. So every time they would update us on something, we would immediately be logged out. And if my mom had called about it, whatever was written down on the chart was cleared.
Wow.
And I'm not saying that it was necessarily something just the hospital did out of spite, but for someone who can't be in the hospital room, the only contact we have is through a nurse on his personal phone. That's just frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
And then they ran several tests. Finally, we got out of them that they were looking for white blood cell counts. And his was really, really high, so they tested him for emphysema. It's for your lungs when you smoke for a long time. That's what they thought it was. So they kept treating him. They kept telling us, the COVID's gone, the COVID's gone. It's just emphysema now. And they still wouldn't let us in the room, even though he had been way past his quarantine date. The disease expert said it would be okay. And they were treating him just like an emphysema patient. It wasn't really COVID anymore. And so they kept him on the ventilator. They kept the settings extremely, extremely high. And it was almost like they weren't letting him breathe on his own because maybe they feared that if they had, he really would have passed sooner. I don't know, but they did that, and about a week before probably closer to 4 or 5 days. It makes a huge difference in the timeline. It doesn't sound like it, but it does. They told us that it wasn't actually emphysema at all. It was COVID pneumonia that they were seeing on his lungs that looked like emphysema. And the thing about emphysema is it's for long-time smokers. He had smoked for a little while, but he hadn't smoked in like 30, 40 years, so that's why that didn't make sense.
Yeah.
It was COVID pneumonia, and the only thing they knew what to do was keep him on the ventilator and try to slowly take the settings down. But when they took it down 10%, the next day they would put it up 20%. So it wasn't like he was making any real progress. Um, and then they told us that my grandmother had called, and I actually translated the whole conversation because we weren't sure that we had heard it correctly. Um, the doctor had repeated 4 or 5 times to us that we should really make a decision if we want him to pass or not. And it was more of a, I don't know. He said, we can pull the cord anytime you want.
Oh my.
And I I don't. He didn't say it like passive aggressively or anything, but it was just the way he said it. And they had kept telling us all this time that, I mean, the symptoms that he was having were bad, but they were treatable. And looking back at it, I don't know if that were the case, because I mean, I don't know, so early into COVID there there were really any treatments. I mean, if there's not really good treatments now for COVID, I can't possibly see there being any when it's a fresh new pandemic.
Yeah.
But after that, we just felt uncomfortable because of that sort of language towards him being in the hospital. So we requested a new doctor, and we got one. And she told us that she agreed with the other doctor. We needed to. She said it in much better terms. She said we needed to start talking or thinking about we needed to start thinking about what we thought about resuscitation. And they pulled us. I didn't know what it was at the time. I had seen so many families go into like a quiet room, but I didn't know what it was because I mean my grandfather was the first significant death that I'd ever been through. And they pulled us in and they said he did not have any orders regarding resuscitation. Not written down anyways, not officially printed or anything. And we had all knew that his biggest fear in his terms, and they're not very sensitive terms, so forgive me for saying them, but he says he didn't want to be a vegetable. Um, he he wanted to live his life to the fullest, and he didn't feel like he could if I mean he was constantly he had already lost his legs in Vietnam. He didn't have either of his legs. He had some struggles getting around with that. So his biggest fear was not only being in a wheelchair his whole life, but also consistently had up having to depend on regulated oxygen.
Yeah.
He was such an independent person when when I was still in elementary school years ago. He used to get in trouble because the VA technically has him as disabled, but all he wanted to do was work. All he wanted to do was prove that he could do things, and he owned a lot of businesses. He owned a lot of land, um, and so the idea of him, he didn't like it.
Yeah.
Being independent on medical assistance. So my grandmother finally made the decision to um, sign a DNR for him, basically as next of kin, saying that. And that was the other thing is my grandparents, they don't believe in power of attorney. and they're very stubborn people. They want their own decisions all the time. But that made it very difficult because if my grandmother had power of attorney, I really think that she would have had more control over what was happening as far as his care.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a decision she made, that he can be resuscitated. And then they told us that there's a really, really good chance that he would have a heart attack. Not because he had heart disease or he had any chronic history with heart disease, um, but it was something developing because his lungs were hardening and they weren't getting the oxygen flow that they were supposed to. And so we understood and we went home that night because I mean we had already made the decision that if something like that happened, just to let him pass if it had came to that.
Yeah.
And we all went home that night. I haven't ever talked about it before. I've never told anyone. I think I thought if I don't talk about it, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
This is my first. I've never lost someone so close to me, so intermediate to me. So I don't know that I've had the chance to heal the way I'm supposed to, because it was about 1.5 years ago now, but it still feels very, very fresh.
Yeah.
So, but we went home that night, and I remember my brother shaking me. He was shaking me. He's like, something happened to Grandpa. And I'm like, you're stupid. That's what I told him. And he just kept shaking me. He's like, no, something happened to Grandpa. You've got to come. And we had went over to my grandmother's house, and she told us that he had had a heart attack. He had a massive heart attack, and it was that night that he had the massive heart attack, and then we came in the morning, and then they said that they hadn't done CPR because he still had a pulse. And so he was kind of recovering from the heart attack, but it wasn't very. It was he wasn't directly on life support, but he was completely medically supported as far as his life, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so they pulled us back into the quiet room, and they said, "What would you like to do? Because if we pull him off the ventilator, he won't make it."
Yeah.
And my mom said, if we pull him off the ventilator, will it hurt him? Will he feel pain? Because that was a big fear just of my family's. I don't know necessarily about him, but my family didn't want him to feel pain. And they told us actually that he probably would feel it a little bit, which I think is insane.
Yeah.
But that's what they told us. And then so my mom said, what are the chances of him recovering? And they told us basically nothing. I mean, he was barely hanging on. So my mom told the doctors and the respiratory therapist that she would like him to be completely sedated as he passed, to make it completely painless. And so we let the respiratory therapist, or not the respiratory therapist, the anesthesia nurse come in and inject sedation. And they started taking the ventilator out. And I sat through the whole thing. I didn't want him to be alone.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, oh my goodness. And then when we left, moments later, my mom had checked his chart, and they had already called his time of death. They had already put in everything they had given him. Basically, they had done his assessment, and so under his assessment, the only thing that he went in with was, of course, extremity loss, which didn't have any underlying diseases really or medical conditions. It was just extremity loss. And then minor high blood pressure. I mean, nothing serious, but something that maybe needed regulated a little bit. That's what he went into the hospital with, aside from the diagnosis of COVID. When he left the hospital, he had 13 other diagnoses that were either caused or, I don't know what the right word is, caused or induced by COVID.
Wow. Do you remember what some of them were?
They told us that they suck really high with the emphysema still.
Hmm.
And then the COVID pneumonia was directly under COVID. And then kidney, acute kidney injury. And then high white blood cell counts. And then that there were so many.
Wow.
But those were the ones that they had continuously they tried to be transparent with us about. Everything else that was happening, we had no idea. I mean, the doctor called us once a day for 4 minutes. So that's all we got leading up to his death. And we got to sit in his room the last 5 days before he had passed. But at that point, he was so sedated while he was on the ventilator that it was really hard for him to acknowledge that we were here or that we were in his room. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
He acknowledged one person. He actually opened his eyes, and they caught it on camera. And it was to me telling him I loved him. And that was the last time he had opened his eyes. And they had taken him, and we had made our funeral arrangements. And one of the biggest things that he wanted was he wanted a big funeral. He wanted to be surrounded by a bunch of people after he had passed. And the most frustrating part about it is people had found out how he got COVID, which was at a funeral, and what he had passed of. So a lot of people came. We actually had to move to a completely different room because there were too many people.
Mm.
But a lot of people were too scared to come.
Yeah.
Which is completely understandable. We never wanted to push anybody. We followed all mandates, all rules, just in case. And it makes me sad because he didn't get to the full extent that he should have had.
Yeah.
and he had a funeral that was a military honors funeral.
Oh, that's beautiful.
He actually had one of the biggest recruitment teams from Fort Leonard's Wood, which is where in the army. That's where he that's what platoon he was stationed with. They came down to be pole barriers and um, do the salute and, and give my grandmother the flag after it had been folded. And he was also honored with a news crew. They came down and they videoed the whole funeral. It was beautiful. The video is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
It was closed casket, of course, but the way that they presented it, it wasn't disrespectful. It was beautiful. And I think he was very uncomfortable with being honored for being in the military. And I think it was just because of the era he was in the military. As far as it was Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I think I think that would be the other time I'd see him cry if I got to see him cry again, is because it was beautiful.
Yeah.
Um, I just wish there were a lot of things that I knew back then, or even the medical staff, because I mean, it was new to them too. I don't blame them necessarily for anything, but there's a lot of things that I just wish we all knew as a country, as a nation, as far as COVID.
Yeah. I want to ask a couple questions. I know that you work in a hospital now, right?
I do.
And so I want to go into that in a little bit. Your grandpa was 69 years old.
He was right before he passed.
Yeah. So by any stretch in my mind, not at the end of his life or um not someone, who's he had a lot of life left to live.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned was how he knew how he didn't want to be like he did not want to end up in a hospital without any brain function.
Yeah.
Did he spend time with his friends from the Vietnam War? Did he ever get together with them? Did he talk to them? And the reason I'm asking is, do you think that he had a sense of what other people had gone through, and so he knew what he did and didn't want?
My grandfather didn't talk a lot about the military. I think one of the biggest reasons why is because I think he I I don't know that he struggled because I don't think he had any PTSD, and if he did, he never showed it. Um, but in I think it could have affected it a little bit, and the reason why is because I mean he didn't want to talk about any brutality that went on while he was in the military. Um, and when we did ask questions, it was usually about, I mean, the aftermath of war, not necessarily what happened in the war, but the aftermath of war. And so, I mean, I think there's a possibility of it. But as far as the military, he didn't talk about it a lot. It's not something he wanted to face. So I honestly don't know,
Okay.
but it's very possible because he always talked about the consequences. He always talked about the aftermath of what war did to someone, not necessarily like what had happened in that moment of war. He didn't talk about the good times. He talked about the serious times, the things that he thought were most important because a lot of people risked their lives. A lot of people did end up without any brain function.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think it's possible, but ultimately I don't know.
Okay. And the other question I want to ask you, he passed away on December 28th. So, what was the holiday like for your family during that time?
Um, not great.
Yeah.
So, um, we my grandmother didn't want to do anything for Christmas at all, which is understandable. But we put up a tiny tree, and I just remember we did gifts and normal Christmas traditions, but it wasn't the same. Normally when we open gifts, we talk to each other, we show gratitude towards each other. I mean, um, we're a spiritual family, so we pray over our gifts. We do a lot of very traditional activities, but that whole holiday, that whole Christmas, we just sat in silence. All you could hear was wrapping paper. All you could hear was sniffling. It was just silence. There was something missing, and it wasn't the same. And then um, the other thing is, he actually passed away 3 days before my birthday.
Oh.
It was my 19th birthday.
So that's something that you will have with you every year.
Yeah, because 3 days isn't. It's not a big change. I remember for my birthday, who was my fiance at the time. He wanted to do some things with me, and I did do some of them. He tried to make my birthday as special as he could. I spent a little bit of time with my family, but at the end of the night, I just wanted to be alone. And he used to always play Sudoku on like a little game type thing.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how to play Sudoku. I still don't know how to play Sudoku. I never will. But I remember going into Walmart and I bought one of those little games and I tried. And one of his favorite foods was potato soup. So I remember pulling my car into a restaurant, and that's what I ordered, was potato soup. And I also don't like potato soup, but it tasted really good that night. And then I think something that's really interesting, and it's it's crazy, but it's interesting. My grandfather's favorite song was called "A White Sports Coat," and I don't listen to that type of music. I don't enjoy it. It's, in my opinion, I don't think it's a horrible song, but it's something that plays in my car every single time when it connects to my Bluetooth. When it connects to my Bluetooth, and I don't even have the song on my phone. I don't I haven't bought it. I don't have it downloaded. But every single time I get into my car, it looks itself up, and I have to change it. And that started on my birthday, so I just think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's your grandpa hanging out with you.
Yeah, it's at some point. Sometimes I just roll my eyes because it's happened like over the last 2 years. But I think it's a really special thing because, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so let's talk a little bit about the hospital and talk about what you're doing now and the things that, because when we talked on the phone, you said you'd learned a lot about COVID, and working in a hospital has enlightened you to the whole process. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, and then also you told me that you got kicked out of his hospital charts. Do you still have access to it now, or is it was it taken away?
So we didn't have access to his charts for about 2.5 months.
Okay.
Um, Eventually, yes, we did have access, but everything pertaining to him having COVID was very vague on the chart. And it always kind of was very vague on the chart. But so I get to read charts now in the hospital.
Hmm.
It's something that I've become familiar with, and they're usually very detailed. So a lot of the doctors, they use something called SOAP, and it's subject, objective, assessment, and then plan. And there's supposed to be really, really detailed notes about what happened. And when you look at the COVID doctors that took care of my grandfather, or the surgeons, or DO doctors, they're like 4-word sentences.
Hmm.
And they're supposed to be like 3 or 4 word or sentence paragraphs. And each diagnosis has a CPT or ICD code that goes with it. With COVID, at the time, they didn't really have a specific ICD code or CPT code. Now, of course, they have one. Don't ask me what it is because I have no clue. But now they do have one. And so I think with his charts, they were so vague that it's almost like not having them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But as far as COVID itself in the hospitals, I think one of the most frustrating thing is because I got a teaching degree before my grandfather had even went in the hospital. And the reason why I got a teaching degree is because I was very squeamish with medical terminology and just healthcare. I didn't like talking about it or seeing it. And so I went the other route. And when my grandfather passed, I decided I wanted to pursue healthcare because that's what I originally wanted to do. I just couldn't. And my grandfather's death, I think, kind of desensitized me in a way.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to school right now to be a nurse, and I actually work in emergency trauma as a special representative. And I'm the first person people see when they come into the ER. I do all the chief complaints. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things is even after seeing the numbers, and most people nowadays know someone, maybe not really, really close to them, but someone they've met, someone they've talked to. I mean, a real life person. They may even went to their funeral and maybe not have shed a tear, but they just know this person who's passed. Most people do know someone like that now.
I agree. Yeah.
Um, but they still, I mean, they'll walk around the hospitals. I've had so many people report me about keeping the policy to just restricted to one waiting room, because the nice thing about my hospital specifically is they do allow one person with you if you have COVID symptoms, and there's a specific waiting room with filtrated air that they keep all COVID patients in, but you're still not, you're separated from non-COVID patients, but you still have the comfort of someone with you.
Yeah.
That's what I really appreciate about my hospital. But at the same time, even some people would come in with their whole families, and I understand that you want to be there, but you have families of 10 coming in, and then they won't stay in one place. I mean, it's not even a matter of your whole family coming in. If you have that support system, I guess that's fine. I mean, there's way more of a chance of spreading COVID, but I understand from the family perspective, but no one takes precautions. They get mad about masks, and I, I, I personally don't know how well the masks work, but if they do work, they're not harming me, I'm gonna wear it.
Yeah.
Same with the vaccination. If it's not gonna harm me and it's gonna prevent someone else from passing, I'm gonna get it, and that's how I feel about it. But there's so many people who, I mean, regardless of what their political views are, they don't have common courtesy for other people. I had a patient come in and cough on someone for being uncomfortable with them not wearing a mask. I mean,
Oh.
there's so much disrespect for COVID because they haven't lived through losing someone. They haven't lived through how problematic the symptoms can be.
Yeah.
And then even now, I've noticed that doctors have a really hard time treating it. I mean, their first instinct isn't ventilator, 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 or um, anything like that. Because I know I've noticed as a trend from March 2020 to about probably close to March 2021, most COVID patients that I had seen were on a ventilator.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they were treating severe cases of COVID, because it is a respiratory for the most part. But they still don't have a great way to treat it, and for a lot of people that leaves them scared
Yes.
because they feel sick, they feel really ill, but they don't they don't know what to do about it, and then they lean on these doctors, and these doctors don't know either. And that's why I say do I think my grandfather had great care in the hospital? No, I don't. I think he was very, very neglected. But I don't think it was from lack of care. I don't like feeling wise, like emotional care. I don't think it wasn't because they didn't want to see him succeed medically. I think it's because honestly they were just as scared as we were about it. They had no idea, and I mean, you have to think these healthcare workers. They go in every day, and then they have babies, they have family.
Mm-hmm.
From my side of the point of view, I used to get so mad at doctors. I used to get so mad at medical staff for their policies, their procedures, their lack of knowledge. But then when I turned around on that other side, yeah, it's all frustrating, but everyone's just doing the best they can, and that has changed my opinion a lot on how I treat other people as far as COVID. And then with the people who are just completely disrespectful with other people who are taking precautions, who are thinking about how they can p- prevent it from spreading, I just feel sorry for them.
Yeah.
They've never had to feel that pain.
Yeah, and we don't want them to feel that pain.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to ask, how is your grandma?
Um so for the first 3 or 4 months, she became very, very, very bitter, which was so strange because she had been such a kind-hearted person.
Mhm.
But she was incredibly, I mean, towards everyone. She didn't want to talk to me, which is weird because I mean, she was like my best friend. She still is now that we've kind of went through it together, but she really just turned the whole world off.
Oh.
Something that really affected her was my grandfather's family didn't call, they didn't come over after he passed, probably because they were grieving as well.
Mhm.
Um, but they didn't, she felt like they didn't care. And so that made her even more in a slump. And she did not want to admit she was depressed. She didn't want to admit to, I mean, feeling what she was feeling. And then I mean, pretty much directly after my grandfather had passed, she actually had open heart surgery. She had a
Oh.
bypass. Um, and they took her completely from her home, and they told her she was too high risk, that she had to go to a 4 hour away hospital. And so she not only went through her husband passing, but she also had potential risk of passing as well. And I think the worst part about it is I think at some point she wanted to be with him. I mean, she wanted to pass as well. And that was really, really heartbreaking to hear.
Yeah. They spent so much of their life together.
Yeah, I mean, their whole life. And
Yeah.
I think something that is interesting about it, though, is eventually she did kind of gain some of, I mean, herself back. And it, but kind of in a completely different way. My grandparents were very old school, and my grandfather didn't like when she wore makeup, so she just didn't wear makeup while he was alive. And I'll never forget. She's like, "Do you want to go to the store with me?" I'm like, "I guess." So I go with her, and she wanders into the makeup aisle. And I mean, I think she bought every single thing on every single shelf. But
Oh.
she had went home that night, and she says, "I don't know how this stuff works." And so I did her makeup, I did her hair, I dyed it and curled it. So I just it it gave her a bit of herself back. So
Yeah.
she, I think she still struggles, but at the same time, um, I won't ever say she's grateful for my grandfather passing, but who she was with my grandfather for the last 60 years was a completely different person. So now she's got to rediscover herself as her own person. And I think that's really special. And in a way, I kind of feel the same way. My grandparents were always my rock. I had always, been around them. And my grandfather was, I mean, like a mentor to me. And then all of a sudden he's gone. And I feel like, because I'm still very young, but when he passed, I was 18, almost 19. I had just turned 19 after he passed. So it felt almost like I basically given up on my childhood in a weird way, if that makes sense, because my mentor is gone and I feel like I have to do it on my own. And that's kind of what I did. I went back to school. I started working in the hospital full time, and then I bought my first house. And all of it happened within the year of him passing. And he wasn't there to see it. He wasn't there to see what he encouraged me to do, what he taught me to do. And I'm only 20 right now, and that's a huge accomplishment for someone who's only 20.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It seems like he's watching over you.
Yeah, playing annoying songs on my car radio.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a year later, a year and a half later, you've gone through all of the firsts and the Christmas holiday and your birthday again. What things are you doing to cope and to heal?
I keep myself busy because I feel like if I don't keep myself busy, I start to think about it, and I'm really hard on myself. So if I'm just sitting down and think, what can I be doing to impress him, to make him proud of me? And that's a really bad mindset to have. So I just do things that make me proud of myself. I just being productive, doing things that make me happy. Something that I did in my teenage years was I was a lifeguard. Um, and I was on a swim team. And so um, that th- I do that a lot to cope is swimming.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. So, one last question that I ask everybody who is on the show is, what do you say to people who tell you that COVID isn't real?
I'm sorry. The first time that someone asked me or had told me COVID wasn't real, I got so angry because I mean, it's funny because the person who told me COVID wasn't real was someone who was married to the news reporter who reported my grandfather's funeral.
Oh, wow.
So I that just made me even more angrier is because it was something that was very visual in her family. But I tell them that I'm really glad that they feel that way because I am. If if you haven't had to go through it to realize it's real, I'm so glad that someone doesn't have to go through that same thing, because it's hard. I didn't get to see my grandfather. I didn't get really any closure. And so I'm so glad that someone else has the perspective that it's not real, because they don't know.
That is an amazingly gracious way to look at it. That actually gets me. Like, that's so gracious, Amberly. That's amazing. I mean, I feel angry, I feel all kinds of things, but to really look at it with that open-hearted way, that's beautiful.
It's I can't. My younger brother, when he was going through it with us, he wanted to be a pastor. He was very, very strong in faith, and he struggled a lot with it since my grandfather passed really badly. He doesn't want to be a pastor anymore, and part of that is because of what he had went through. He had so much faith in our spiritual beliefs that he thought our grandfather was going to come out and just live, and it would have been nice, but that's not what happened. And so for Cody, he was so angry all the time. And then he had lost 3 other people very, very close to him. He had lost a school friend, a mentor from church that he had stayed with a lot. His wife had passed. So Cody had lost not only our grandfather, but 2 or 3 other people that he knew very, very personally. And just watching my brother go through that, because he knows. And one of his, well, they're not friends anymore, but one of his friends, after Cody was describing what happened to our grandfather, he had explained he didn't have legs, and the kid said it sounded like he needed to die.
Oh.
And to say that to someone, it just, you can get angry about it, but it doesn't make me feel better. So if I can't feel better about it for myself, at least I can feel better for someone else, that they don't have to feel that way. And I think at the same time, it is like a coping mechanism, because I'm hurt, but that doesn't mean you have to be, as far as how people respond to COVID and saying it's not real. It's not something that happens.
Yeah. And what was your grandfather's name?
Raymond.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to me today and being on the show. I hope that telling his story and talking about it in such detail helps.
I was sitting here actually thinking, I feel like a weight has just been lifted off my shoulders, because I've never talked about it. I've never told anyone about it. I've just kept it kind of inside, because I don't know why, actually. I've kept it inside for so long. So I do feel better. I feel relieved.
Good.
Yeah. So I appreciate you having me here and letting me talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And that's the show, everyone. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. This show won't ever have a members area or episodes that you have to pay to listen to, but there are expenses to hosting a podcast, and if you'd like to help, you can support this show at buymeacoffee.com/forthosewelost. The link is in the notes below. If you like this episode, please share the show. Share it with your friends, share it on your social media, and once you've done that, rate and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. and then go rate it on Apple Podcast, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. Ratings and reviews are the main way this show finds new listeners. So please share the show. Until next time.